Hello, my name is Stephen Thomas. Today I'd like to talk about wonders, miracles, and all of the amazing things that we read about in the Bible. And then people ask the question almost longingly, why don't those miracles and wonders happen as often today? And that is the question that I'm going to address. And I've titled this, Terms and Conditions Apply to God's Promises. Now, let's start with a very easy one, like God heals all your diseases, Psalm 103 verse 3, written by David, who experienced many miracles from God, fought many battles, and yet he died fairly young he had circulatory problems. Not all his diseases were healed. Well, terms and conditions apply to even this promise. And if you look at the context in which it was written, and yet it's often quoted out of context that every single sickness should be healed today, if you're a Christian, this was given in the context of in the resurrection and in the future kingdom, all diseases will be healed. And we know that even in the kingdom, if you go to the last chapters of Revelation, there's a tree of life and it's got leaves for the healing of the nation. So it's like an ongoing thing that people are healed, even in the very future. So there are terms and conditions that apply. Now, what about these signs shall follow them that believe? They shall cast out devils, speak with new tongues, take up serpents, drink deadly things. They will lay hands on the sick, and the sick shall recover. That's in Mark 16, verse 17. And whatsoever you shall ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. That's Matthew 21, verse 22. So, I'm just choosing these as examples of promises of God. Whatsoever you shall ask, believing, you shall receive. So is the problem and the term and the condition, you just have to believe. And this is what's often given out as, the only thing standing in the way of your faith is your healing is your faith, because it says the prayer of faith shall raise the sick. And I'm not doubting that the prayer of faith shall raise the sick, but I'm saying, is that the only term and condition, or is it a fact that God has to every time heal all your diseases? So are there perhaps hidden terms and conditions that are worth considering? So when we come across a broad and sweeping statement such as you find in Matthew 21:22, whatsoever you shall ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. No other conditions seem to be placed upon it except belief. I would like to just explore something with you. Now, if you look at some of these things that are promised, these signs shall follow you, shall cast out devils. Where are you likely to encounter devils? Or isn't it in an evangelical setting that you're more likely to encounter devils? Weren't all the times in the New Testament when devils were encountered when the disciples went out preaching the gospel? So, yes, that's more likely. You'll speak with new tongues. Is it if I just want to speak Hebrew that I ask God and He will give me a new tongue? Or did this seem to apply, for example, in Acts, in the preaching of the gospel, Acts 2, on the day of Pentecost, where they spoke in new tongues, or when the Holy Spirit fell on some of the believers in the act of the preaching the gospel, and the new believers, the Gentiles even, spoke with new tongues? Was it in the context of preaching the gospel that they spoke with new tongues? Take up serpents. The only example I can see is Paul on the island of Malta when he was shipwrecked, in doing the gospel, on his way to Rome to preach to Caesar, I think it was Nero, on his way in fact to be martyred, that he took up a serpent on the Isle of Malta, it latched onto him. People expected him to die. He didn't. And then they all saw the power of God there. So it was in the pursuit of the gospel that this promise applied to Paul. They shall drink deadly things. They shall lay hands on the sick. So even on the Isle of Malta, Paul then, in preaching the gospel, laid hands on the various inhabitants of the island, and many of them were obviously impressed, and possibly many of them believed. So in preaching the gospel, we see these things apply. And if you go through the Bible and look at where miracles occurred, wasn't it always in pursuit of God's plan, in furthering God's plan, or in furthering the preaching of the gospel? And as an interesting pattern, haven't you just noticed how virtually every case where miracles occurred, the person performing the miracles went through trouble, perhaps was martyred, and the promises that were given and the miracles that were seen were accompanied the preaching of the gospel. So it wasn't just like I wake up one morning and I feel, I'd love to look like Brad Pitt and have the bank balance of Warren Buffett. Okay, all I have to do is believe, and I'm going to, well, the Bible promises it, so doesn't the Bible also say, I wish above all things that you may prosper and be in health? Well, if you look at the context, it's spiritually prosper. Paul couldn't care less whether you prospered monetarily, and your health wasn't that important. It's your spiritual health that's important. So we kind of think that, well, these promises just apply to you, the Christian. This is just one of the side benefits, you could say the perks of being a Christian. Or was the context of these promises in connection with those that preached the gospel? That is the point that I'm making. And look at the price that they paid. Now, no one performed more miracles than Christ, but would you be prepared to give up your divinity, come and live on earth, be annoyed and harassed by inhabitants of the earth for his 3.5-year ministry and then die on a cross? He paid a price. So in pursuit of the gospel, the Father's will, Christ is the quintessential poster person for performing all miracles, but I'm saying there was a cost. Well, what about all the early disciples, including Paul, Peter? Every single one of them was martyred. Every one of the apostles except the apostle John, who was banished to the Isle of Patmos. They tried to kill him. I believe they put him in a cauldron of oil, but he refused to. It had no effect of boiling oil, and they couldn't kill him that way, so they had to banish him to the Isle of Patmos. So even he suffered, and that was due. He was protected by a miracle through the promise of God. So we see miracles absolutely occur. And it occurs, as I say, to those who further God's will and preach the gospel. Now, so in the New Testament, almost without any exception, miracles accompanied the preaching of the gospel. They weren't just like magician miracles. Oh, well, to draw attention to yourself, I'll show you how great a magician, how great a Christian I am. I shall now call down fire from heaven and prove. Well, even when Christ was tempted by the devil to prove himself, his spirituality, he refused because terms and conditions apply. Those miracles that Christ was given were not there to just impress people or to prove the devil wrong, because he knew that he was representative of the Father, and the Father who gave him the miracles would disapprove of him just changing rocks to bread to prove the devil wrong, or throw himself off a building and just to, in a sense, tempt God to catch him and prove that he was the Messiah. So terms and conditions apply, and Christ knew that, so he wouldn't perform miracles on demand for the devil or to prove a point. But if you go through all the Old Testament miracles, the walking through as the sea parted, the Israelites as they came out of Egypt, yes, but look, they were doing God's will, and look how they suffered. Or let's say, take Abram. Abram didn't lead an easy life. He had to leave everything behind, and he was in fact prepared to offer up his son on an altar. Not an easy thing to do. So every case of all the Old Testament fathers, the prophets, Elijah who called fire down from heaven, he was persecuted. He had to live in the desert running away from King Ahab for 3.5 years. He had to, when he called down fire from heaven and the miracle was performed, he then got persecuted by Queen Jezebel and so on, and was all miserable. So we see that terms and conditions apply. Yes, I say, if you are prepared with a pure heart to go out and pursue preaching the gospel, not just for filthy lucre's sake, not through any evil motive, and you prepare to immerse yourself like all these people did in performing God's will, preaching the gospel, which is God's will today, I am absolutely 100% certain that you would see the power of God coming to your aid, and you would see miracles. And this is what I mean by you would see those miracles in pursuit of the gospel. But is God going to just make you as handsome as Brad Pitt and as rich as Warren Buffett just because you ask for it? Well, I think we just have to go to James 4 verse 3, which says, you don't receive because you don't ask. There's the first problem. And second of all, when you do ask, you ask amiss that you may consume it upon your lust. Say, if I do ask, I'd love to look like Brad Pitt and be as rich as Warren Buffett. Hey, you're just asking it for totally selfish reasons. And so why on earth would God give it to you? You ask amiss. So terms and conditions apply. This is not just a blanket statement that all Christians will receive anything they ask for. Sure, in pursuit of the gospel, as the whole, read the Bible, see where miracles occur. When people are zealously about God's work, miracles are in abundance. These are people who gave up everything, who suffered. So if you're willing to pay the price, God is certainly, absolutely willing today to perform miracles. And he does for those people who are actively involved in spreading the gospel. So, whenever you see something promised, just bear in mind that all promises of God come with terms and conditions that are applied to the promise. And if we're just going to consume, if we just want to consume it upon our own lust, in other words, try to impress somebody, be very spiritual by performing magical feats or performing some paranormal thing, well, that's a completely wrong motivation, and you're not going to receive from God his power, because that is certainly not what these promises of power were given for.